Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the sci-fi fantasy action film, The Dark Tower. Now, The Dark Tower was co-written and directed by, I'm probably going to butcher this director's name, but I'm pretty sure it's Nikolaj Arcel. I'm pretty sure I butchered his name, and I know for a fact I butchered his first name, but prior to this, he actually co-wrote the 2009 adaptation of Stieg Larsson's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which I actually really liked. Now, the film is loosely based on the Dark Tower novels by Stephen King. Now, the reason I say it's loosely based is because the film is not a direct adaptation of any one of the books in the series. Rather, this is an original story that's simply taken plot elements from different books in the series, which, to be honest, is one of the film's many problems, in my opinion. Now, the movie is also meant to be sort of a quasi-sequel to the novels as well, because the movie is not set in the same continuity as the books. However, this film is supposed to take place in sort of an alternate Dark Tower timeline, and obviously, I don't want to give away how the books ended, but if you've read the final Dark Tower novel, you would realize that that is possible. So once again, the movie is not technically in continuity with the books. At the same time, though, it loosely connects to the continuity of the novels. Now, I've already done reviews on all 8 of the Dark Tower novels, which you could go check out those reviews if you want, and I've actually been rereading and reviewing all the Dark Tower novels for the past few months in preparation for this movie. But in case there's some newcomers watching this video who maybe are unfamiliar with the Dark Tower series, I figured I'll give a quick little synopsis of what the Dark Tower series is. The Dark Tower series is a series of sci-fi fantasy horror novels written by Stephen King. The series also incorporates elements of Western as well. And the main concept of the series is it deals with the whole multiverse theory, the idea that there are hundreds, thousands, perhaps even millions of different parallel universes, and each universe has its own version of planet Earth, and the main premise of this series is all these different parallel universes are held together by this thing called the Dark Tower. And what's really cool about the Dark Tower novels is essentially all of Stephen King's other books and short stories connect to the Dark Tower series in some way, shape, or form. Like, because the series deals with the premise of a multiverse, you're supposed to assume that all of Stephen King's other books and short stories have been taken place in these various different parallel universes that make up the Dark Tower multiverse. So, Stephen King's books like It, The Stand, Insomnia, Salem's Lot, and even The Mist all directly tie in with the Dark Tower series. And once again, because this series deals with the whole multiverse theory, King brilliantly ties together some of his stories that you wouldn't think are connected. For example, obviously It and The Stand do not take place in the same world because The Stand is a post-apocalyptic novel, but because the Dark Tower series deals with the concept of multiple universes, the two books are still connected via the Dark Tower series, even though the two books obviously don't take place in the same world. The same thing goes with The Mist. Now, needless to say, I'm a pretty hardcore fan of the books, and this is a film that I really have been anticipating ever since I first heard that they were actually doing this. And this is a movie that's been in development hell for years. Like, at one point J.J. Abrams was going to do a Dark Tower movie, then at another point Ron Howard was going to do it, and Ron Howard is actually one of the producers trailers for this movie, and I even heard, now this is only something I heard, I don't know how true this is, but I heard at one point even Frank Darabont was going to do a Dark Tower film, and Darabont did have a little Dark Tower reference in his adaptation of The Mist. And before I saw this movie, I was avoiding reviews like the plague. But needless to say, though, this film was a major disappointment for me. However, I did go into the film realizing that the film could be a disappointment, but I also went into the film, like, thinking maybe I'll like it, because once again, I was avoiding reviews like The Plague, and ultimately the film was a disappointment, but I didn't totally hate it, though. For me, this film was just a little above mediocre, but to me, the Dark Tower books deserve so much more than that. They deserve a much better adaptation than what this movie was. Now, I saw this film with a few friends of mine, and one of my friends who I saw it with only read the first 2 Dark Tower books, and he actually liked it a lot more than I did, but he summed this movie up perfectly in my opinion. He called this pretty much a big-budgeted Dark Tower fan film, and that's kinda what it was, and on a certain level, I almost appreciated the film for that, but to me, the film fails because, to me, this film should be appealing to both people who have read the books, but also people who haven't read the books, and to me, the film fails on both accounts. Like, for me, as somebody who has read all the novels, I feel like the film really does kind of oversimplify stuff from the books. At the same time, it also glosses over stuff from the books a little too much, and I feel like this film, for somebody who hasn't read the novels, would be too confusing. Now, the plot of The Dark Tower is it follows this teenage boy named Jake Chambers, who was a major character from the books. However, since this film is meant as sort of a quasi-sequel to the novels, this is an alternate version of the character from the books. But in the film, Jake is having these visions of an alternate universe known as Midworld, and a mysterious Dark Tower, which is under attack from dark forces that want to destroy the tower. And you realize that Jake has been having these visions for some time now, and his mother and stepfather both feel that he's going crazy, and you realize that Jake is also bullied at school because of this, because other kids in his school kind of think that he's a whack job, pretty much, and you find out in the movie that there are these earthquakes happening all over the world, and Jake becomes convinced that these earthquakes have something to do with what's happening to this Dark Tower in this alternate universe. And eventually Jake becomes convinced that if this tower is destroyed, it will be Armageddon in his world. Now you realize that Jake has also been having these dreams about a mysterious gunslinger from this alternate universe, and Jake realizes that he has to somehow get to this alternate universe and find this gunslinger to help him save the tower, which in turn will save his world. Now, in the movie, you eventually find out that Jake actually has psychic powers, and it turns out that there are these humanoid creatures from this other dimension. Now, in the books, they're called the Low Men, but I don't remember if they use the term Low Men in this movie. But basically, these humanoid creatures are going into other dimensions, abducting children with telekinetic powers, and taking them back to this prison camp in Midworld for these kids with psychic powers, and the Low Men are harnessing the psychic powers of these children and using them to try to destroy the Dark Tower. Now, in the movie, you realize that these Low Men work for this evil wizard named Walter, who is the main villain of the movie, and he was also a major villain from the novels. Now, the character's real name is Walter. However, in the books, he also goes by the name Randall Flagg, which is actually the name that most Stephen King fans know him by. And you realize that it's Walter's, or Randall Flagg's, whichever you want to call him, you realize that it's his ultimate goal to destroy the Dark Tower, which holds the time-space continuum together, and if the tower were to fall, the fabric of time and space will be ripped apart, and it will essentially open the gates of hell, and demons will invade our plane of existence. So in the movie, Jake eventually finds this gunslinger named Roland, and the two of them team up to try to stop Flagg and save the Dark Tower, which in turn will save Jake's world and Roland's world and all worlds. Now, in the movie, Tom Taylor plays Jake Chambers, and he actually does do a pretty good job in this movie. Like, he was very likable in the role, and I would honestly say that he was probably one of the better aspects of this movie. However, I will say, and I will admit that this is me being very nitpicky here, but to me, he isn't really the Jake from the books, because Jake in the books is a freaking badass. Now, to be fair, he doesn't really start out as a badass, but as the series goes on, he becomes a really badass gunslinger. But the problem I had with Jake in the movie is he didn't really strike me as the kind of person who could eventually become a badass. And don't get me wrong, he was still very likable in the role, but to me, he wasn't the Jake that I know from the books. And I will admit, though, that is me being nitpicky. Now, in the film, Idris Elba plays Roland Deschain, and Elba is a phenomenal actor, but I really feel like he was wasted in this movie, because in this movie, Roland really isn't the main character. Really, Jake's the main character, and Roland feels like more of a side character, but in the books, Roland was the main character, but in the film, it really feels like Jake is the main character, and on a certain level, I almost feel like that was an interesting direction to take it. At the same time, though, I feel like you get no real character development with Roland in this movie. But once again, Elba is a phenomenal actor, and I will say he does a decent job with what he's given, but I don't think the character was very well written in this film. Or maybe he was, because I also heard Sony really tampered with this movie, and I could tell a lot was cut out of this movie, so maybe this movie cut out a lot of the backstory of Roland and cut out a lot of the character development with Roland, but overall I feel Elba was really just wasted as Roland in this film. Now, the casting of Idris Elba as Roland was actually quite controversial among fans of the books when it was first announced, because Roland is white in the books, but they take a character who is white and made him black in this movie. But here's the thing. I don't really see how Roland's race really changes his character. Yes, he was white in the books, there's no debate in that. At the same time, though, since this is set in a completely, alternate timeline, I could kinda buy that maybe in this timeline the Deschains were black. I could kinda buy that, considering, once again, this is kinda meant to be an alternate version of the character that we know. And once again, even though Roland was white in the books, I don't really see how changing his race really changes the character that much. I think this movie has so many other problems other than the casting of Elba. That being said, however, I know for a fact that if they decided to do a sequel to this and introduce the character of Susanna, who was a major character from the books, into the sequel, and let's say they decided to make Susanna a white woman in the movie, I know for a fact people would be up in arms over that. But also, the thing about Susanna is a character where changing her race really would change the character, because Susanna was a black woman who was taken out of our world in the 1960s, and she was a civil rights activist when she was in our world. And that's a character where changing her race would completely change the character. But the thing with Roland, though, is I don't really see how making Roland a black man really changes the character. Once again, the issue with Roland in this film is he's just not very well written. Another issue I had is, in the books, Roland and Jake have a real father-son relationship, and in the film, the father-son relationship between Roland and Jake really does feel forced and is just so underdeveloped, in my opinion. Now, the one aspect of Roland and Jake's relationship in this movie that I did actually like is, in the film, you find out that Jake's father died a year or two prior to the events of this movie, which was something that was changed from the books, and in the movie you find out in a flashback how Roland's father, Stephen, died, so you get a sense that Roland kind of feels some kind of companionship with Jake because they both lost their father, and that kind of adds to the theme of fatherhood that is in the books, but also I feel is kind of forced in the movie. But once again, that was the one aspect of Roland and Jake's relationship in this film that I actually really liked. Also, there was one moment in this movie that I actually thought was kind of moving, and I wish the film had more moments like this, but there was a scene in this movie where something happens to Jake. I don't want to give away what it is, but it's something really tragic, and Roland tries to comfort Jake as he's crying, and he takes Jake into his arms, and it was a genuinely touching moment, and I wish the film had more moments like that, honestly. Now, in the movie, Matthew McConaughey plays Walter, or Randall Flagg as the character is known in other Stephen King stories. Now, Matthew McConaughey is probably the best part of this whole movie. At the same time, I also think he was kind of wasted as well. Like, in a lot of ways, McConaughey nails his role as Randall Flagg in this film. Like, he really does capture a lot of the essence of the character. At the same time, though, I don't think Flagg was very well written in the film. And I think the film really does downplay the complex relationship between Roland and Walter, because in the film, really all Roland wants to do is get revenge on Walter for something that he did to him, and it just comes off as the stereotypical action movie revenge plot. Whereas in the books, you realize that Roland's hatred for Walter is much deeper than that, because Walter actually pretended to be friends with Roland's father, and really Walter betrayed Roland's entire family. So in the books, the relationship is a lot more complex, where once again, in the film, it really just comes off as your stereotypical revenge plot. And to be fair, the film does kind of allude to what Walter did to Roland's family, but it really does kind of downplay it as well. And there is one scene in the movie between Roland and Walter that I did really like, where Walter is taunting Roland, and if you know anything about the character of Walter, you would realize that that is so up his alley. And there's a certain line of dialogue in this movie that Walter says that really alludes to a certain aspect of his character that I wish they explored a little bit more, but you kind of get the idea that the reason Walter wants to destroy the Dark Tower, which holds the multiverse together, is perhaps he's somebody who sees the extinction of life as being inevitable, and he figures if the world's going to end, I might as well be the one to do it. And I really wish they alluded to that more, but once again, you only get that sense of the character's motivation incarnations in one throwaway line of dialogue that Walter says. Now, in the Dark Tower novels, you realize that Walter goes by many names. Now, Walter is his real name, however, he also goes by names like Martin Broadcloak and Randall Flagg. And once again, Randall Flagg is the name that most Stephen King fans know him by. Now, Flagg is this powerful wizard who you realize has been around for thousands of years, and he's so powerful that some people have mistaked him for being the devil himself, but he's not actually the devil himself, rather he's supposed to be the devil's right-hand man, or more specifically, he's the right-hand man of a demon known as the Crimson King, who is alluded to in the film, and the Crimson King is supposed to be an incarnation of Satan. Now, the character of Randall Flagg is not just a major villain from the books, but he's also sort of a reoccurring villain in a lot of Stephen King's stories. The big one is probably The Stand. Randall Flagg was the main villain of The Stand, and he was also the main villain of The Eyes of the Dragon. The character also made brief appearances in books like Hearts in Atlantis and even The Long Walk. Well, in The Long Walk's case, there was a scene where the main character saw a dark figure standing on the road, and I've always interpreted the dark figure from The Long Walk as being Randall Flagg, but once again, Randall Flagg, he's this reoccurring villain who appears in many of Stephen King's books. Stephen King also wrote a 1999 miniseries called Storm of the Century, and the main villain of that was a character named Andre Lenoge, and some Stephen King fans have interpreted the Andre Lenoge character as being either Randall Flagg or having a connection to Randall Flagg. Now, there was a 1994 miniseries adaptation of The Stand, and in that movie, Jamie Sheridan played the character of Randall Flagg. Now, in the movie, Jackie Earle Haley plays a vampire. In the film, there's this club in New York City called the Dixie Pig, which is actually a hangout for vampires, and the club also has a lot of dimensional gateways leading back to Midworld. Now, this is based on something that was from the books. And in the film, Jackie Earle Haley plays the leader of these vampires that Flagg enlists the help of. But I don't even remember, and maybe this is just something that I missed, but I don't even remember them explicitly stating in the movie that these guys were supposed to be vampires. The only reason I knew Jackie Earle Haley's character was a vampire was because I read the books. And that leads me into what I think is the biggest sin of this movie, is that they really don't explore the world. Like, in the books, Midworld is such a fascinating universe with a really interesting history, especially because Midworld was supposed to be a lot like our world thousands of years ago, and you get hints of that in the movie, but they don't explore it at all, especially because in the books you find out that the ancient civilization of people who once lived in Midworld actually advanced so much in their technology that they created artificial intelligence and they created different types of machines, and in Midworld, in the film, you see, like, all this technology, but the movie does not establish that Midworld is a world where magic and futuristic technology coexist. And once again, I feel like the only reason I understood what was going on was because I read the books and I was already so familiar with this mythos. And I did like the look for Midworld, and there were a lot of aspects of this movie where you could tell they were taking this right from the page, but at the same time, though, they just don't explore it. And I don't want to blame the director of the movie, because, once again, I have heard that Sony really did kind of tamper with this film, and I just feel like I want to believe that there's a good movie in here somewhere. Like, maybe the director's cut of this film is a lot lot better. I don't know, because the film is also co-written by Akiva Goldsman, who is not a screenwriter that I particularly like, but I want to believe that the director's cut is much better. And for all I know, maybe the director's cut of this movie has just as many problems as the movie that's in theaters, but I really do think the director's cut probably explored this world a lot more, but once again, I feel like Sony just tampered with this film way too much, so I really don't blame the director for this movie, or even Akiva Goldsman, as much as I'm not a big fan of him. I really blame Sony for a lot of this film's problems, but once again, maybe I'm wrong. And ultimately, the film just feels rushed. Like, this is an hour-and-a-half long movie, and I'm sorry, you can't do a story like this in just an hour and a half. And the film's trying to combine elements from almost all the books in the series, and you can't do that and tell a coherent story. And once again, I think my friend summed it up perfectly. The film just feels like a big-budgeted Dark Tower fan film, and there are certain aspects of this movie that did appeal to me as a fan of the books, but once again, if I was somebody who didn't read the books, I might be really confused by this. But there are some things about this movie that I do like. Like, the film does have some nice, moments of fish-out-of-water humor. For example, there's a certain point in this movie where Roland comes into our world, and Roland sees this commercial with these talking raccoons, and Roland asks Jake, "Do the animals still talk in your world?" And Jake's like, "It's a commercial." Wait, what do you mean still? Like, that was a genuinely funny moment. There's also a part of the movie where Jake gives Roland a hot dog, and Roland's like, "What's this?" And Jake says, "It's a hot dog." And Roland's like, "Savages. What breed is this?" Like, there were some funny moments in the movie. I just wish the film had more of that. So, overall, The Dark Tower, while there were some things about the movie that I did like, I would say overall it was a disappointment, which is a shame because I am such a hardcore fan of the books. But as I mentioned before, I hope maybe the director's cut is possibly better, and I hope one day we'll get to see the director's cut of this movie. Now, I'm still holding out hope that maybe the new adaptation of Stephen King's It would be better than this, and it does actually look really good. My only issue with this new It movie is I feel like they're kind of missing the point of what made Pennywise so scary in the book and in the 1990 miniseries, because in the film, at least based on every trailer that I've seen, they just make Pennywise look like the stereotypical evil clown, and I feel like that's kind of the wrong way to go about it, because in the book and in the 1990 miniseries, Pennywise looked like a regular circus clown, and that's what made it so horrifying when you found out that he wasn't even human. But it does look like they're at least getting the other characters from the book right in this new It movie. Now, because the book It does tie in with the Dark Tower novels, I actually wondered if maybe this new It movie would tie in with this Dark Tower film, but I doubt it because the two films are being released by two different studios, but I do think they kind of missed a major opportunity to do sort of like a Stephen King cinematic universe. I mean, in this movie, you did have the little Pennywise reference, but I feel like that reference was just there because the book It connects to the Dark Tower books. I don't think it was actually supposed to be a connection to the new adaptation of It that's coming out in September. But once again, even though this film was a disappointment, I'm still holding out hope for this new It film. But yeah, that was my review on the Dark Tower, and if you've seen my reviews on the Dark Tower novels, I hope you enjoyed this little journey I've taken into Stephen King's Dark Tower mythos, and yeah, long days and pleasant nights to you.